Thank you all for coming here. Today we have Neha Sami. Uh, Neha Sami is a faculty at the Indian Institute of Human Settlements in Bangalore, where she leads the research program and is also associate dean at the School of Environment and Sustainability. She has a PhD in urban planning from the University of Michigan, a master's degree in environmental management from the Yale School of the Environment, and a BA in economics from the University of Mumbai. Thank you so much for coming here. Over to you.
Thanks. Thank you for having me. Good evening. It's really a pleasure and privilege to be here and to showcase some of the work that we do at IIHS, although there are lots of friendly and familiar faces who know some of this work already. But before I start, I do want to acknowledge the contribution of a lot of folks who have, sort of worked on different aspects of what I'm going to be talking about today. Several colleagues at IIHS, a couple of whom are here, both past and present. And much of this work was also displayed a few years ago as part of an exhibition that we did at IIHS. And so what I'm sharing is part of the work of a larger collective, like everything else that we do at IIHS. And I would also like to kind of acknowledge the support of two large UKRI grants that actually made the work, a lot of the primary research that we did, for this part of the work that I'm going to draw on today, Peak Urban and Urban No. I'm happy to share more on either of those projects a little bit later if you would like to hear. So this is Bangalore from the 1800s. And it was a survey map conducted by the British in 1800, over April and May 1800. And over the last 3 decades, as most of you who are familiar with Bangalore will know, that the city has grown very rapidly from what used to be a manufacturing hub into a global center for information and technology and related services, drawing primarily on its strength as a knowledge economy. However, to be able to understand how and why this has happened, how the city has grown in particular ways, and the current and emerging challenges that the city is facing, we need to go much further back. Much of what we are seeing today, much of the kinds of challenges that we deal with today are emerging as a result of multiple layers over many, many centuries almost. So today's Bangalore was formed, including sort of spatial form, the city's economy, the institutions that govern the city, have roots that go back to pre-colonial Bangalore, actually. And to understand how the contemporary city is governed, it's really important for us to be able to unpack the overlaps between not just urban governance, but also economic governance, to understand how our natural resources in the city are governed, particularly water. It's important to sort of acknowledge that this is a process of city building that goes beyond just state and city institutions and is a collective and cumulative process that unfolds over many, many different stakeholders across many different time periods. And this is, of course, true not just of Bangalore, but of any city. But we'll talk about it through Bangalore's history today. And I think it's important for us to both acknowledge and understand that while a lot of these are shaped by history, and it's also not enough to attribute these challenges and the kinds of challenges that we face and potential solutions to historical causes alone, because there are actually active processes that are playing out now that will are shaping contemporary Bangalore and also Bangalore's future. So, like I said at the start, drawing on research that we have done at IIHS over the last 5 to 7 years, I'm going to chart the journey of the city from a small trading settlement to today's Bangalore. And we'll move through the city chronologically, starting from the 1800s, and try and examine multiple intersecting layers and transitions that the city has gone through: economic, environmental, spatial, and layer that over the city's physical and spatial sort of terrain to be able to understand sort of where we are today. And what I hope you'll take away with you at the end of this talk today is the interconnectedness of all of these different aspects, and the fact that we cannot hope to tackle contemporary or emerging challenges of not just Bangalore, but any city, if we do not consider all of these different components as part of a larger system of systems. So before I get into the talk proper, I also just want to add just a word on the sources. So a lot of the maps that you see, including this one, were acquired as part of these research projects that I mentioned from the British Library. A lot of the other maps were created by colleagues in the audience who were at our geospatial lab and also at the urban informatics lab at IIHS. This talk also draws extensively on Karnataka State Archives, a range of books, papers, and policy documents, as well as a lot of our own primary work that we've done at IIHS. And a lot of this is available at the IIHS library. I'd be also happy to share more information on any of these later. So, while the city's history goes back to almost 450, 500 years, the city that we recognize today, as you would have noticed from the earlier map as well, began to take shape roughly in the 16th, 17th century under actually the Vijayanagar Empire in two distinct ways. The first was, and as you can see from the older map, actually, if I just go back to it for a minute, is that a lot of this was basically the old kind of historical core of the city, the pete, and sort of the economic core of the city. And it continues even today to be part of, very sort of central to a lot of the economic activities that we see in Bangalore, and a lot of a lot of the city's culture, commerce continues to be there. The other important thing was that the system of sort of tanks and bunds and lakes that provided a regular supply of water to the city also kind of started out from the southern part of the city to these early settlements, and the British then built on those and continued to develop them. So in the late 1700s and towards the 1800s, the city became part of a military cantonment town under the British Empire, and two distinct parts emerged, therefore. So the southern part remained something that was under the Mysore royal family, governed from Mysore, while the northeastern parts of the city, what we call sort of the towns, the Kant area today, started to be developed by the British. This led not only to the development of new neighborhoods, the creation of employment and trade, for both the old and new parts of the city, but it also led to the creation of a lot of the social infrastructure that we still see. Hospitals, schools, and primarily a lot of this was set up to support the British military at that time. And the rest of the city fell under the Mysore kingdom. And so as we see a lot of those patterns of urbanization that emerged over the 17 and 1800s, spatially shaped the city, and we see a lot of those in contemporary Bangalore today. The old city, for example, continues to echo those economic activities that were practiced, almost 3 centuries ago. Also, the physical layout of the city and the spatial layout of the city has echoes back to some of those things. So you ended up seeing also two increasingly densely populated areas, which is the old part, the Pete area, the part of southern Bangalore, as well as sort of the northern, northeastern parts of the city that developed as two distinct commercial entities in the city. And even now, when you think about it, the kinds of economic activities that you see in the north and the northeast of the city are very different from what you see in the southern parts of the city. And these, again, have roots going way back. Not only that, a lot of the transportation infrastructure, a lot of the rail lines, the bus lines, bus terminals, etc., that were created were distinct for two different parts of the city. So the southern part connected much more to Mysore because that's where the center of power was, and the northern part, and the connections from there were out towards Madras because that's where the colonial seat of power was. And so, again, these are part of the sort of panels that we put out for the exhibition, but I just want to point out a couple of things here, which is that the lakes systems that you see over here were all kind of man-made, the bunds that were created, and a lot of traditional surface water systems were actually what supplied old Bangalore with its water. And by the 1800s, however, we start to see, sort of more engineering-led approaches to accessing water. So the cantonment actually started tapping Alsoor Lake, putting pipes down and getting water in from there. So you already start to see how the history of our kind of, governance of natural resources is not something that's a sort of new challenge that the city is facing, but has been something that we've been struggling with for about 2 centuries now at this point. At the turn of the century, which is roughly 1880 to the early 1900s, was characterized by the emergence of significant public infrastructure in the city. Bangalore was actually one of the first cities in the country to get electrification, which led to the manufacturing sector actually being set up in the city. The first industries were kind of set up as a result of the electrification that came to Bangalore. Water networks started to emerge, rail and road networks started to emerge. And so the history of manufacturing in Bangalore goes back to sort of the turn of the century, around sort of the late 19th, early 20th century. The industries that were set up separately in both parts of both the old city as well as the cantonment area. The Mysore government and the British cantonment took completely distinct approaches to setting up these industries as well. And so that also led to very different spatial and socioeconomic patterns that emerged in each of these neighborhoods. And again, it is actually quite key to remember that the British and the Mysore government had very different approaches that actually play out even now in the way, as the spatial form of the city plays out, in the way, in the kind of settlements that you see in a lot of these parts of the city. Most importantly, the differences became apparent in the development of water infrastructure. Like I said earlier, the rail infrastructure started being built out, connecting one part of the city to the colonial seat in Madras, the second going south to Mysore. The Mysore government and the royal family from there set out the first wave of industrialization in the 1880s with the establishment of woolen, cotton, silk, and oil mills. And if you go, around the southern part of the city, you'll still see kind of remnants of some of these that still exist. A lot of these industries were located very close to water sources. They drew and depended a lot on lakes in and around there. And there was a kind of tussle even then about sort of ownership of these lakes between sort of the state, whether it should be privately owned, who paid for the cleanup of the lakes, for example, because there were also local communities that depended a lot on those. The second sort of fallout of that also was that as these industries developed, we began to see a lot of planned housing that started to emerge around these. So they were very specifically catering to worker housing in and around these mills. So, planned neighborhoods like Chamarajpet started to come up around these mills and industries. As we went on into the sort of early 20th century, we started to see a lot more industries being set up in the sort of northern and eastern parts, catering specifically to the British cantonment. So you saw the distilleries come up, you saw the tobacco factories come up. So, if you go towards the towns, you still see sort of the big ITC factory, which is the Imperial Tobacco Company, which had set up, and it has histories back to catering for the British cantonment at that time. There was also a big burst in the 19th century, in the late 19th, early 20th century, around water planning for Bangalore, which was undertaken particularly by the cantonment. And they established the Bangalore Water Works in the 1880s, which is in some ways the precursor to today's BWSSB. And as engineering solutions started to make access to water much easier, the reliance on the older network of interconnected lakes and tanks and bunds immediately started to decrease, because the reliability of water supply that came through piped water was much more much more reliable than having to kind of depend on dealing and maintaining the traditional system of lakes and rajkalaways and tanks and bunds. The other big kind of watershed moment that happened at the turn of the century was the plague. And that fundamentally shaped a lot of the neighborhoods that we see in Bangalore now. So Malleshwaram, Baswangudi, but also parts around Fraser Town, around Richardstown, Coxtown, all of those sort of emerged as a response to the plague and sort of needing to sort of clean up the city in some ways. And a lot of these ideas of sanitary planning, a lot of these ideas of spatial planning and distinct sort of grid-based networks started to emerge around the time of the turn of the century. But again, you start to see that these cater to particular types of communities, they cater to particular types of people who lived and worked in those neighborhoods, whereas the area continued to remain, and you still see kind of the spatial form in the layout of the city today. And the other kind of thing that can sort of roll out the city's the city's kind of markers were the major arterial roads. So a lot of the major arterial, the Old Madras Road, for example, the roads that connect in and out of the city, that cross the city, started to take shape and take form again at the turn of the century. So again, these are older kind of patterns that have existed for a very long time, and we're just kind of building on top of those. And so the spatial form of the city that we know today had already started to take shape by the early 20th century. What is less evident from these maps partly is the fact that there were two distinct systems of governance also emerging as the city kind of evolved, because the colonial government governed in a very particular way with very particular sort of impetuses. And similarly, the colonial government had a very specific set of sort of governing motives in some ways. So you also began to see different systems of governance start to emerge, which also played out in the way these areas developed. So the early kind of 20th century, up to about 1940, started to see a much greater emphasis on industrial development. Sort of the root of the city's manufacturing was kind of laid down there. And this was both through public enterprises as well as private enterprises. So again, this history of entrepreneurship in Bangalore, but also state support in Bangalore goes way back. Simultaneously, there were a lot of education institutions, such as what is now IIHS, but it was then called the Tata Institute of Science, was set up. There was also a shift that took place of moving the state administration from Mysore to Bangalore. And so you began to see a lot of the civic institutions and the foundation for the civil services actually start to emerge, which would then enable sort of governance of the city post-independence as well. The sort of electrification and the emergence of steam-powered textiles meant that there was a revolution in the industrial structure, which led to changes both in public space, in administration, in the utilities that were available. The garment industry was actually set up with electrical looms in Bangalore, and actually was set up with electricity here before even sort of Bombay or Ahmedabad. The state government itself played a very important role but the state government, in this case, it was the Mysore government, that played a very important role in encouraging industrial growth through labor laws, but also through sort of direct ownership of setting up enterprises like the porcelain factory, the electric factory, the sandalwood soap, the Mysore sandalwood soap factory. And this continues even now with successive state governments, focusing a lot on supporting industry in the city today, although over the last few decades, the focus has moved away from garment manufacturing, much more towards supporting IT and the knowledge economy. The visibility of these plants, the fact that the state was investing so much in these plants, spurred a new wave of entrepreneurial activity. So you began to see auxiliary, smaller private sector industries start to get set up. A lot of these were actually, because they were kind of set up by the Mysore state, they were all located on the western side of the city. And again, you start to see, when you look at a map of contemporary Bangalore, that a lot of that pattern of where sort of manufacturing is located, even in the city now, holds to that older system, because the northern and the eastern side of the city were actually under the control of the British cantonment. And so a lot of these industries couldn't actually expand and be situated in that part of town. The growth of the city's population, the industrial demand, particularly around water and electricity, as well as rainfall shortages, actually brought out the kind of challenges of the water system even way back then. And public debates, as they do now, started to focus on large-scale schemes to start increasing water supply into the city. Current discussions about the sustainability of sort of Bangalore's water challenges mirror the debates that went on in the early 20th century as well. And then, as now, Bangaloreans who could afford to dig bore wells and put down tanks in their own sort of private neighborhoods did so. And so the history of kind of tapping your own water source, your own water supply, is also something that goes back to the early 20th century. Poorer sections of the population, particularly in the Pete area and in the sort of old city, continue to suffer from water shortages, and that history sort of continues. Again, the map here is sort of starting to, you can see sort of in the middle of the map, the spatial form of the city start to build out. You can start seeing a lot of the sort of the public and private industries that are sort of popping up around the city. You start to see the kind of built form of the cantonment start to emerge. You also start to see in the northern part of the city a lot of the education institutions that still exist. The decades between sort of 1940 to 1970 were tumultuous, both for the country but also particularly for Bangalore. This was the time of the Second World War. It was also when India became independent, and both of these had very significant impacts on the city's spatial form and on the city's economy. They shaped it very differently in different ways. A lot of industrial units were actually set up in Bangalore to support the war effort. During the Second World War, and this is where sort of the foundation of high-tech manufacturing in Bangalore started to emerge. So a lot of what we see, sort of HAL, for example, was set up to be able to support the British war effort. There was a new airport near Bengaluru Lake that was sort of, and used as a base for the Allied forces during the war. It also had a significant impact on industries in the city where a lot of what became the PSUs, the public sector undertakings, was set up in the post-independence era, but they built on this older foundation of sort of manufacturing that the British had laid down specifically to serve the kind of war effort then. This also led to a transformation. So even now, if you go to the sort of what used to then be the periphery of the city, there's a lot of older worker housing that emerged around there to be able to house those who came to work in a lot of the PSUs, to be able to provide housing and a whole range of other services to industrial workers. And these were not meant for workers alone, but also provided services to other residents who lived in and around those areas. Post-independence, the sort of Bangalore strategic location away from India's borders led to the establishment of several sensitive, nationally sensitive PSUs on the peripheries of the city, which included ITI, Indian Telephone Industries, HMT, Hindustan Machine Tools, BHEL, Bharat Electronics, Bharat Earth Movers. All of these were situated, so the big five kind of PSUs ended up being situated on the periphery of the city, which is now way in and now has become sort of incorporated within the city boundaries. But these were actually set up as planned townships, not so very different from gated communities that we see today, but specifically by acquiring large tracts of land from villagers. Again, not very different from the way in which sort of real estate markets are working today. The difference in these was that they provided a whole host of social amenities, such as schools and hospitals and sort of public spaces, but also kind of allowed that to sort of, like I said earlier, have access and use by other communities who lived in and around there. So it wasn't kind of fenced off in the way a lot of gated communities are today. With independence and the shift of the state administration to Bangalore, also brought a reorganization of the state government itself. Bangalore emerged, rather than Mysore, as the capital of unified Karnataka in 1956, and this led to the city's population almost doubling between sort of the 1940s and the 1950s, partly because of its expansion of its industrial base, that kind of support needed to support production for the war effort, but also with the state capital moving here, there was a huge surge in government and administrative employment. A whole set of urban governance institutions started to emerge around this time. The City Improvement Trust Board, which was established by the Mysore state in 1945, along with the Bangalore City Corporation, and a whole range of other public agencies was set up around this time to oversee the development of planned residential layouts in the city. These were the forerunners of today's BDA and BBMP. The population growth in the city and industrialization led to a significant rise in the demand for public infrastructure as well. This included power, water supply, and transportation. It saw a particularly large burst of growth around road transportation, actually. And in the 60s, a proposal was made to convert the large dried up expanse of what was the Dharmabuddhi tank into what is now Majestic. And so this starts to tell you why a lot of those areas flood because they were actually lake beds. And the contours of the city and the terrain of the city is such that, those are the sort of lower lying areas in Bangalore. So, in 1968, Majestic was set up on the bed of an older lake. There were also increasingly a larger number of electrical power stations set up that were sort of expanded all around the city's periphery. And at one point, Bangalore was actually electricity sort of positive, and so we used to sell power to a lot of neighboring states. And that also kind of contributed to the expansion of the city's economy. The BWSSB was founded also around this time, and soon after the BWSSB was founded, the first stage of the Kaveri water supply scheme was laid down. So this was in the 1960s. As soon as the arrival of Kaveri water to the city basically started to kind of lead to the large-scale neglect of the older system of tanks and bunds that we had here. And the arrival of Kaveri water immediately kind of led to administrators not considering the maintenance of lakes and the maintenance of the Rajkalaways and the connectors as being important anymore. And I think that one of the things that are particularly kind of interesting is that as you start to see, and this is just one of the examples, a lot of the as roads started to get built out, you also started to disrupt the kind of traditional Rajkalaways that connected lakes to each other. And so not only were the older systems disrupted, you actually had kind of this lack of ability of water channels to flow that used to use the terrain of the city. And so a lot of the kind of challenge that we see around very localized flooding, for example, today, has its roots in the way in which sort of the city was built out over the 20th century. The sort of dominant image of Bangalore until the 1970s was that of a modest-sized, small state capital, despite being a site of very sort of vital public sector initiatives. A scale comparison, however, now of Bangalore with other comparable megacities in India reveals that it is the city with the largest spatial extent today. The city's footprint increased by almost 100% in the 1990s, with 134% of an increase in built-up area, which also led to a sharp decline in sort of water bodies and natural vegetation in the city. A lot of this was also, of course, as the city sort of spatially expanded, and then I'll talk about that later. In 2007, sort of, the city's footprint just doubled automatically as we incorporated 100 new villages around the periphery of the city into Bangalore. But in the 1970s, a lot of ancillary and many sort of small-scale industries came to be set up to actually be able to supply and provide kind of support to the larger industries that were set up. And so you saw, for example, the emergence of Pina and Pina Industrial Estate that continues even now to support sort of ancillary and auxiliary industries in the city. And so you saw sort of not just Pina, but also Rajajinagar, Yashwantpur, all of these emerged as sites for small industrial estates that provided support to larger industries. The high-tech nature of Bangalore's industrialization all the way from the 1940s to now sort of started laying down the foundation for the IT industry that sort of came particularly, started in the 1980s, but particularly post-liberalization in 1991. And so the economic reforms sort of the 1990s marked a distinct change in Bangalore. While the 1950s to the 90s had been characterized by large public sector investment, we started to see post the 1990s a large growth of private sector investment, particularly from IT and sort of related industries. This was not in the absence of state support, however. Like I said, there was a lot of kind of, support given in terms of land, in terms of reduced cost or discounted electricity and access to water, often at the cost of other manufacturing, industries, particularly garment and textile. Companies like Texas Instruments, Infosys, and Microsoft began constructing large campuses on the edge of the city. To bring in more businesses, the state government of Karnataka, led by S.M. Krishna's government, started to offer a lot of land and tax incentives in addition to building a lot of infrastructure projects like elevated roads. The metro construction started then, and a new airport, and the setting up of special economic zones around the city, which catered specifically to the IT industry. The rapid sort of growth of these new economic sectors and the growth of this kind of knowledge economy, particularly spurred by IT, has also led to a considerable boost in the real estate economy of the city, both regionally as well as locally. So you start to see not just within the city itself, but also on the peripheries. I mean, if you go out the airport now, it's quite apparent and obvious the scale of real estate development. This was also, the 1970s was also when, in 1985, when the BDA was set up, was when we saw our first plan. So the first master plan for the city was made only in the 1980s. The imperative for the formulation of the plan itself was the massive growth that the city experienced in the 1970s and into the 80s, when the city's population grew by nearly 50%, mostly due to migration into the city, but then also, as the city's economy continued to grow. Post-91, there was also a huge investment in infrastructure, particularly sort of road infrastructure, and not so much investing on sort of rail or although the Bangalore-Mysore infrastructure corridor was sort of proposed then, the suburban rail system, which we still haven't got, goes back to the 1990s as well as a rapid transit system, which again remains, to be seen. The rapid growth of the city, a lot of unauthorized settlements and construction and informal settlements was all sort of what led to governing authorities, particularly the BDA, to regulate the growth and development of Bangalore and to also start to encourage other growth centers in the state. However, a lot of this remained spatial. So a lot of this was the master plan was spatial. It focused very much just on the city and sort of land use specifically. In the second city development plan that was authored in 1995 as a master plan for 2011, the narrative quite distinctly shifted, and we started to see sort of this acknowledgement of Bangalore as a primate city, of the state deciding to put all its eggs basically in the Bangalore bucket and investing only in here to the cost of other growth centers across the city. Provisions for industrial estates were created near sort of the eastern part of the city. This is when you saw the big kind of investment of ITPL in Whitefield come up. Marthalli around Hosur Road, a lot of these investments started to emerge there, catering to the still kind of growing, at that time, the IT industry. This growth also led to challenges around managing water. And so you see that Bangalore's growth and Bangalore's growth trajectory has kind of has been driven very closely with the way in which our water resources have been managed and our water resources have been governed. So the challenge that we see around water today are not new, but we still haven't found a way of kind of being able to live with and find a solution to coping with our needs for water. The network of sort of hundreds of man-made lakes and wetlands that had captured rainwater for irrigation of various kinds was disrupted as lake beds started to get more and more sort of reclaimed and dried up for development. And so you start to see sort of this intensification of the city's growth. A lot of it again managed and governed by a whole host of different institutions, some of which are at the state level, some of which are at the city level. So, for example, a lot of the investment in industry and infrastructure was done by the Karnataka Industrial Areas Development Board, which is a state institution, but had a very significant impact on the way the city emerged and shaped. And so we come to now. The city's recent population explosion has been completely unprecedented in the city's history. In the decade between 2001 and 2011, again, the population almost doubled to close to 10 million. One of the fastest growing agglomerations, not just in India, but globally. This was partly, like I mentioned earlier, due to an expansion of the administrative boundaries of the city. And so you start to see the shape of what is contemporary Bangalore emerge today, right? This is kind of BDA and BBMP boundaries today. In response to this growth, yet another master plan was proposed in 2015 that promoted a specific compact city model that promoted the consolidation and the sort of intensification of the urban core while establishing secondary mixed-use centers on the periphery of the city, including the sort of development of public transit nodes. In reality, today, a lot of what used to be, largely residential areas, such as Malleshwaram, Koramangala, Indiranagar, have all emerged as sort of mixed-use commercial hubs that are no longer kind of just residential, but that has also put an increasing amount of pressure on the infrastructure in these regions, because the infrastructure there was set up to cater to residential layouts, not to cater to multi-mixed-use settlements. Peripheral areas around sort of Whitefield, Sarjapur, Electronic City, the new airport have witnessed this spurt of high-rise mixed-use developments as well. And these are all extremely water-scarce areas. Structured and sort of connected by a radial road network, which is the ring road, and then the peripheral ring roads, and sort of continuing to build around those. The city has expanded around Tumkur Road in the northwest, around Bellary Road in the north, Old Madras Road towards the northeast, and Sarjapur and Hosur roads towards the south, as well as Mysore Road and Magadi Road. And again, these are roads that had actually been set up, if you remember when I spoke earlier, to build connections out towards Madras and towards Mysore as part of kind of older patterns of connectivity. This is further kind of, in the north, we also have, in addition to the airport, there's also the KIDB Apparel Park that has been set up, that are serving for sort of major catalysts for urban development, particularly real estate development. Pina and Tumkur Road is now transformed into one of the largest manufacturing hubs in the city. Electronic City in the south is a major pole of growth. But again, Electronic City is actually not really part of Bangalore per se. It is its own independent governing entity. And a lot of this actually played out during the pandemic, where Electronic City was suddenly unable to access a lot of public health infrastructure because all of it was entirely privately set up. However, there are increasing concerns, as I'm sure we're all aware, of how sustainable or how equitable this growth actually is. The benefits of the city's growth have not been shared equally across all socioeconomic groups. There is a large population in the city that is vulnerable on multiple indicators, particularly around public health and access to water. Groundwater levels in the newly developed peripheries along the city do not receive municipal supply yet. And the groundwater has fallen steadily as a result of extraction for private self-supply, as well as through the private water tanker industry. There's been a further kind of pressure on water, particularly because of sort of the emergence of new infrastructure, especially the new airport, which is situated in a very, very sort of water-scarce region of the city. In parts of the city where we do actually have, which is the central part of the city, where we do actually have sort of high groundwater, this water is increasingly contaminated by sort of leakage from sewer lines and wastewater from surface water bodies, where a lot of waste is being dumped. And so the water infrastructure, which is really our sort of weakest link in some ways in the city, is threatened increasingly by environmental degradation, indiscriminate sort of land use planning, and as the city continues to grow out in areas where there are serious groundwater deficits. And so rapid urbanization, complex land markets, a growing population, and increasing pressure on the city's physical infrastructure and natural resources have led to a lot of very serious socioeconomic as well as environmental challenges that Bangalore is now facing. And unplanned utilization of resources is making us year on year prone to increasingly severe water scarcity. Large variations in rainfall and extreme rainfall events, coupled with sort of insufficient planning of water and stormwater infrastructure, are being exposed to flooding. And a lot of these are where, among the sort of the most vulnerable populations in the city, as well as a large number of informal settlements in the city, are located. And so you end up having increasing vulnerability of those who live and work in those neighborhoods. In terms of the governance of the city particularly, there's been a gradual emergence over time of a whole range of urban institutions in the city. And as you can tell a lot of these were layered one on top of the other. They weren't actually sort of, they were kind of built on the foundations of older institutions. And there are therefore multiple agencies with many overlapping jurisdictions and functions. For example, just for planning, we have the Bangalore Development Authority, the BBMP, as well as the BMRDA, all of whom are tasked with making master plans for the city with overlapping jurisdictions. Similarly, while our master planning processes, whoever does them, take into account only spatial planning, there is very little acknowledgement in the city or in the planning process itself of the role that natural resources play, for example, whether it is water or energy or land, in not as parts of spatial planning, but the way they sustain the city and the kind of planning around natural resources that is needed to maintain Bangalore and on a sort of sustainable trajectory. It also doesn't take into account the urban economy at all, apart from zoning decisions. And so to add to that, there are sort of institutions that are, like I mentioned, that operate across different scales, across different jurisdictions, and not just at the urban, but with significant impact on both the spatial form of the city, but also how the city continues to grow. Many of these being responsible directly to the state government. And so where do we go from here as far as the city is concerned? There are many experiments sort of underway in the newspapers over the last 6 to 8 months. There have been proposals for the trifurcation of the BBMP to split it up into smaller jurisdictions. There are also proposals to think about it using a regional development authority to plan particularly for natural resources at a scale that goes beyond, for example, thinking about water particularly. And so we need to start thinking about new forms of urban governance, new ways of thinking about new structures in the ways in which our cities are governed. Are there ways in which we can think about scale and about governing that is problem-free? Think about it from the point of view of how do we govern for housing? How do we govern for water? How do we govern for the economy? And then sort of work backwards from there rather than going, by being sort of determined by the urban boundary alone. And there are new ways of thinking about jurisdictions itself. So, when you think about water, perhaps the watershed is a better sort of jurisdiction around which to govern rather than to think about governing only for the city alone. I mean, even BWSSB right now provides water to both Bangalore urban as well as Bangalore rural. Reimagining these structures and jurisdictions that help us deal with the challenge actually that these institutions need to resolve, as opposed to going sort of jurisdiction first. And so to think about new ways in which we can actually enable urban transitions that are taking place, whether they're from rural to urban or small urban to medium urban or big urban to mega urban as sort of the Bangalore metro region is emerging. And there are kind of ways in which we can think about identifying triggers, think about identifying patterns that allow us to anticipate some of these changes, to anticipate and think about some of these, as opposed to sort of sitting back and being reactive to a lot of the challenges that we're facing. So I'll stop there. Thank you.